and I'm 18, and I'm from a really big family. There's 7 of us kids. Yeah, it's awesome. And some of them are from Africa, and yeah. So I'm going to share a little bit about what God's been teaching me lately, like in the last 3 months, I'd say. What I've been learning about is love. It's pretty cool, right? Yeah. It's a good thing. Yes, exactly. And I kind of got to thinking, just what is it? What does it look like? What does it look like in people? What does it look like in the church? You know, how do we look at that? And really the 2 verses that just, or well, 1 verse actually that kept coming to mind is, where'd it go? is Matthew 22:36 through 40. There's a man who was asking Jesus a question. He said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment." So I kind of took that and I was like, okay, I know that, I've heard that a lot. I was like, and then it kind of struck me that really our faith is based on and it's made up of love. Our God is love, and I didn't even realize this fully, but it comes out all over the place. How many of you people have heard or know John 3:16? Yeah, right? And say it with me. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Okay.
Go team.
Go
Canada! Go Canada!
What's the 4th word in that verse? Yeah. There's a big emphasis on it. I mean, for God so loved. He didn't just love us, like, oh yeah, I kind of care about those people on that planet, maybe I should do something because they're kind of in a mess. But he says he so loved us. That's a big emphasis. If you love someone so much, if they're in trouble and they're hurting, you care about them, right? You feel broken with them, you feel pain with them, right? So that kind of struck me, that God so loved the world that he sent his only Son to die the most gruesome and horrible death on the cross that you can imagine, just so that we could love him back and be with him forever. That was pretty cool. So that was the first part of that verse. And the second part, when Jesus was talking, he's talking about the commandments. He says, "And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." And that got me thinking again. So I was thinking, love your neighbor as yourself. I don't know. When I think of neighbor, I typically think of, like, it's people across the street. They're literally, your neighbors to your house. Or I think of, friends. But I have to quote this guy, Francis Schaeffer. He wrote a book called The Mark of the Christian, which is exactly what I'm talking about. He says it a lot better. But he said that all men are our neighbors, and we are to love them as ourselves. Because really, that's what neighbor is. It's anybody that we come in contact with. That's a lot of people. I don't know. It's pretty easy for me. Is it pretty easy to, love your good friends, like your best friends? Right? That you see at school, that you're close to and you can talk to, right? How easy is it to love your family? That's a mixed reaction. Yeah. I don't know, it can be really easy sometimes, and sometimes it can be really difficult. Loving your siblings. How many of you have siblings? How many of you have more than one sibling? Yeah. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? It's really hard sometimes when they're sitting on the one nerve you have left, and they're have a rusty spoon and they're just kind of rubbing it back and forth. Yes. I had time to think about it, yeah. But, right, so it can be really hard, right? And so the other thing that really struck me when I read this verse in Matthew is that when he's talking about loving your neighbor, that includes your siblings. And that includes your family. I was like, okay, I can do that. I tried this, and I lasted, we're going to say, a half an hour to be safe. It didn't work very well, right? Because you try, and it goes pretty well, and then someone does something that's a little annoying or irritating, you're like, oh, we're toast. Back to where we started again. And that's not what we're called to do. That's what I found when I was reading about this. Love that we're supposed to show to everyone is, it's all over, and it's God's love. It's not our love, because it's really difficult to truly love someone unconditionally. God gives us a perfect example of that by sacrificing his most precious son, right, for us. That's like, can you imagine if you had a king, like a lord of a castle, and one of his servants, not just like, a servant that, worked in the courtroom, you kind of had a higher status, but like the servants that would, like, I don't know, pick up the scraps off the floor and feed it to the dogs. If that servant had messed up and the king said, oh, you messed up, but I love you so much that I'm going to take your punishment for you. Doesn't make any sense, right? That's unconditional love. And I realized that that's what God shows us. And I think that's why the first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Because if your soul and your heart and your mind are completely focused on loving God, then it's a lot easier to love people.
Praise the Lord.
Yep. My place. Okay, right. So then I took that idea, and I realized that that's why it's the first and greatest commandment. I mean, it says it right there, but sometimes you kind of like just read it, and you don't actually understand it and know it and live it. So I finally figured that out. It's the first and greatest commandment for a reason. If we're not loving God, we're toast. We're not even going to last a half an hour. It just doesn't work, So I took that, and then I had to apply that to love your neighbor as yourself, because they're connected. That's the second greatest. It says all the laws, so all the Old Testament laws and, like the guidelines and things that Paul sets up in Colossians later in the New Testament, where he's talking about how wives submit to your husbands, and, he's just kind of laying down a godly lifestyle. All of that is hanging on these two commandments. So once I understood the first one, I kind of moved on to the second one. It's like, okay, love your neighbor as yourself. If your neighbor is all people, how do you love all people just as much as you love and take care of yourself? It's a lot of people. I mean, just when you guys were in high school, there's 1,800 students, I think. That was in 2006, right? That's a lot of people, just at the high school. I mean, the middle schools, I believe, had, about 600 students each. It's a bunch of people that you're in contact with. And sometimes, those people have hurt you, or lied to you, or cheated on you in some way, or betrayed you, or talked behind your back. It's not easy to love people when they do that. If someone hurts you, it kind of develops into this, it can develop into bitterness, right? Because you can't understand why they would do that to you. And so that kind of put a roadblock on loving my neighbors as myself, right? Because that's a huge thing, to be able to love people that have hurt you and mistreated you.